So, modality, and thus the external resistance type, the actual type of physical activity you're engaged in, doesn't seem to matter for physical fitness. Now, a final point in terms of actually engaging in types and modalities of exercise. So we've highlighted that it doesn't seem to matter for physical fitness. We've highlighted that unless you're actually a hunter-gatherer, you don't need to be engaging in hunter-gatherer type activities. But that shouldn't mean that carte blanche, you just pick whatever exercise you want. What you need to do is consider other factors as well. And injury risk is a very important factor to consider because certain types of exercise have higher injury risks than others. And I'm sure Bill will be providing a great presentation on whatever day it is he's presenting regarding some of the risks associated with certain resistance training practices. Now, what I want to highlight is that there are certain exercise modes and types of activities that inherently have higher risks than others. So for example, endurance running. Now, it doesn't matter whether you forefoot strike or rear foot strike or whether you're barefoot or whatever. There seems to be a high risk of injury from engaging in endurance running. Okay, yeah, we'll improve your physical fitness. If you enjoy it, great, do it. But when you're making these types of decisions, you need to weigh up the risk to reward ratio. CrossFit, pretend I didn't say that again, but recent studies that have looked at CrossFit have shown that the injury rates in them are extremely high. And what's even worse is not only are the risks high, but the actual severity of the potential injuries are very high as well. Because when we're looking at injury risk in exercise, we should be considering not only the prevalence of the injuries, but also the types of injuries that are sustained as well. In the studies that have looked at CrossFit, 7% required surgical intervention. I don't know about you, but exercise is supposed to make you fit and healthy, not put you in the hospital. When you look at resistance training injuries as well, because resistance training, doesn't get a free ride just because endurance running produces a lot of injuries. Typically, resistance training type injuries tend to stem from free weights and typically from people dropping free weights on them. So yeah, okay, so using a machine or using a barbell doesn't seem to provide any differences in terms of strength or hypertrophy, but if you drop one on you, it's probably going to hurt you a lot more. So you need to consider what the risks and rewards associated with those types of things are. Engaging in certain types of resistance training activity as well is important to consider. Olympic weightlifters in the 2012 and 2008 Olympic Games, they had a 1 in 6 chance of getting an injury whilst performing Olympic type lifts. And you've got to consider, these guys are the best in the world at this, and they still get injured 1 in 6 times. It's important to consider these things, guys. Okay. So let's wrap it up and let's draw some conclusions and make some recommendations. So as I said, evolutionary fitness or paleo fitness is massively popular at the moment. And one of the purposes of this talk was to try and get you guys to think a bit critically about it in case you've been influenced by it and are thinking about maybe trying it and that sort of thing. Up until now, the recommendations have typically relied on suggestions that physical activity adaptations should dictate what types of exercise we're engaged in. And I think that's a bit premature based on the research that we've reviewed here. Also, the fact that physical activity patterns in hunter-gatherer populations are so divergent, and the fact that we can't actually draw out what the physical activity patterns of extinct hunter-gatherer populations were. So we can't even make recommendations based on that information because it doesn't exist. So, historically, this focus has been on volume of physical activity, but as I've said, I think the intensity or the quality of the exercise that you're performing is far more important. It seems to be the most significant controllable variable to determine those physical fitness outcomes that we were talking about at the start. So, to draw some recommendations in, I'm going to provide some very general recommendations here. What can you do? So 1, you should select a mode of exercise based on your personal preference, if we're just considering the physical fitness outcomes. Because as long as it's intense enough, it doesn't seem to matter what mode of exercise you're engaging in. So, choose it based on your personal preference, or choose it based on your sporting requirement if you're an athlete. But you need to consider on an individual basis the risk-reward ratio associated with those types of activities. It doesn't matter what you do in terms of getting fit, but if you're more likely to get injured doing that activity, only you can make the decision as to whether or not it's worth engaging in it. 2, focus on utilizing a high intensity of effort during your exercise. That seems to be the most important factor. Don't worry too much about volume or frequency. Auto-regulate what you're doing. Train hard and you will get the benefits. And then kick back, relax. Don't worry too much about being sedentary the rest of the time because, funnily enough, we've got groups of healthy, fit, low disease rates in hunter-gatherer populations, other primate species, you spend a lot of time sitting around, not really doing a lot. So I wouldn't worry too much about overblown claims regarding the effects of being sedentary. Thank you very much for listening, guys. If anyone's got any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
All right, let's give it up for James Steele.
Hey, James.
Hey.
Is there any actual evidence that compound exercises produce muscles that are more adapted to competitive sports?
Sorry, are there any, let me just repeat that. Is there any evidence that compound exercises produce greater sporting performance improvements than other exercises? In a word, no, not particularly. If you, as I said, when we actually look at the compound, the idea of training particular motor skills that transfer over to other motor skills. Okay, what you've got to consider is that the adaptations that will occur in the musculature in response to the exercises that you're performing, that's what's going to actually transfer over. The ability to squat more is only going to be useful if you're actually a power lifter. So the skill associated with those types of movements are useful in sports that involve those types of movements. But squatting a barbell is not exactly the same as sprinting or engaging in any other kind of skill that, although it may involve that kind of triple extension that the NSCA is so fond of, it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be performance improvements resulting from that as well. It's also very hard to actually define sporting performance and actually research it and study it. We can only really look at kind of surrogate markers of performance, so like sprint speed, vertical jump height, those types of things as well. And there doesn't seem to be that much evidence that there's a transfer of skill from performing a certain type of exercise to another. There seems to just be a general benefit of strengthening and producing hypertrophy in the musculature involved in those types of movements.
So you're saying that the only ways to produce more better muscles for a sport are just to play the sport, and otherwise you can do just any exercise to...
Well, what I'm saying is you need to differentiate the skill conditioning associated with the sport, so getting better at the sport, as opposed to the physical conditioning, i.e. producing a more robust physiology to then take part in that sport. So the idea of trying to create sport-specific type activities in your training is a bit folly, because all you're doing is training a motor skill pattern that is actually irrelevant for your sport, because although it's superficially similar, it's not similar enough, or it's not the same, such that the motor skills will actually transfer over to that sport. You're better off producing an improved physiological fitness to then go and practice the skills involved in that sport. And that may involve compound exercises, that's fine. But there's no real evidence, in my opinion, that actually supports them being better than doing any other kind of strengthening. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I have a question about, it's really popular now, the sitting is killing us and stuff like that. Could you cover that? Because they're making tables now that stand up and everything.
Well, disclaimer, I do actually stand at work a lot. I don't typically sit, but that's mainly because also I tend to walk around a lot at work anyway. I'm actually in the process of considering what my presentation for a conference next year is going to be, and one of the things I want to do is actually perform a more rigorous review of the claims regarding sitting time and it killing you. From what I can tell from the literature, it seems to be that there's been very poor efforts to kind of control other confounding factors that might be associated with sitting. So people who typically spend a lot of time sitting typically engage in other unhealthy activities as well. So their diet's probably bad. They probably don't do any exercise. They probably, they might smoke, or they might have other psychosocial factors that might be influencing it as well. So one of the things I'd like to do is spend a bit more time going into the literature to try and draw out what the real association between sitting and all-cause mortality is. So looking at those hard kind of endpoints rather than looking at surrogate markers as well. But I'm certainly not convinced at the moment that sitting is killing you. There seems to be a lot of evidence counter to it as well when we consider things like the populations we've looked at here, they do spend a fair amount of time sitting, and that doesn't seem to have much of a negative effect on them. There may be some, counter effects in terms of there may be some bad effects of it that counter some of the beneficial effects of more higher intensity effort exercise, but I'm not 100% convinced of that as of yet.
I have another question. So if you go to the gym, what's better, isolation exercise, because you covered that, or full body exercises? And also after those high intensity trainings you've had, what supplements are the best to recommend?
Okay, well, in terms of compound versus isolation exercises, that's a very broad topic, and it's a very broad question because it's specific to the musculature that you're actually looking to train. So the studies that have looked at comparing compound and isolation exercises for example, changes in upper limb strength and hypertrophy, so bicep, tricep hypertrophy, haven't really found much of a difference in terms of compound and isolation exercises. So in terms of upper body exercise, it seems you can get the same benefits from doing compound pressing movements and compound pulling movements without the inclusion of isolation movements as well. Now, obviously, you've got to consider that the studies are always only 10 to 12 weeks in length, so whether or not it will make a difference over the long term, it's more difficult to say. But certainly, there doesn't seem to be any specific benefit there. But contrastingly, in my kind of specific area of research actually relates to the lower back and lumbar extension type training. That seems to be an area that does benefit from isolation type work, and it's very, very difficult to train using compound work. So for example, deadlift type training doesn't seem to have much of an effect on the lumbar extensor musculature specifically, whereas isolating them using specific equipment tends to have a more beneficial effect. So it's a question that has different answers depending upon what muscles you're talking about. And supplements. My advice is always, I always send people to the same place, and I don't know whether I can say this up here or not, but typically I always stick to looking at examine.com for that. I'm not an expert in nutrition or supplementation, so I wouldn't want to step outside of my bounds. But typically, if you want to know what I take creatine, whey protein, and vitamin D, and that's about it. They seem to be the only things that are consistently supported by the research.
One more question, because we're just about out of time.
Hey, thanks, James. If James was trying to increase his VO2 max, what would his weekly training look like?
James as in me?
Yeah.
Right, okay. That's an interesting question because I could increase my VO2 max by considering the specific protocol of the test that I was using and, like I say, actually improving my skill in that test. So if I was doing a treadmill test, I could spend some time practicing the treadmill test. Now, if I was interested in just looking at what physiological changes I could make to produce that, I would be engaging in specific training for the musculature involved in that type of test. So I would be engaging in, say I was doing a treadmill VO2 max, I would be doing high intensity type resistance training, training my lower body musculature to failure, and doing some running alongside it as well, because obviously there is skill involved in that as well. The idea of improving VO2 max is, it's funny, I've just been teaching sessions on this over the last few weeks for my second year physiology students. It's a concept that, although it's very difficult to define and actually test properly VO2 max, you can test maximal oxygen consumption under certain conditions, and it's making sure that the test that you're performing is obviously replicable. So it depends on the test you're performing. If you just want to improve it and demonstrate you can improve it, then there's a way of doing that. But if you look at the literature, there seems to be sufficient evidence to suggest that actually just training the musculature involved in that intensely enough seems to produce the physiological adaptations that catalyze improvements in that physiological fitness outcome. So as we showed in the paper that I gave the presentation on a couple of years ago, the few studies that have compared, for example, resistance training and aerobic type training on VO2 max seem to show that there's very little difference in terms of the outcomes, assuming they're both performed, the intensity of effort is controlled in them. So for example, the resistance training is performed to failure, whereas the studies that haven't done that don't show that. And in terms of the physiological adaptations that catalyze that, you see that obviously both modes of exercise, assuming the intensity of effort is high enough, produce improvements in mitochondrial biogenesis, so increased mitochondrial volume, increased mitochondrial enzyme activity, increases in capillarization, so more blood flow to the local musculature, and so on and so forth. So my training would be essentially resistance training to failure because that's the training mode that I prefer, but I would imagine I would get the same benefits from doing, for example, high-intensity interval training as I would from doing that. It's just that I prefer the strength training because, like I said in the presentation, I consider the injury risk to reward ratio of engaging that as well. And I feel I'm far less likely to injure myself doing resistance training than I am doing running.
Let's give it up for James Steele. I know we got a ton more questions for him, but we're going to have to answer those outside because we still got 2 more speakers today and some good stuff. Awesome.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, guys.